Okay. Good evening. So it's evening now that we're delayed, right? Thank y'all for your patience. I really appreciate that. Hate to start this event late, but it's going to be so well worth it. And I want to welcome you to the Judge Griffin B. Bell Lecture Series. Griffin Bell, an Americus native, he graduated from Georgia Southwestern in 1936. He became the 72nd Attorney General of the United States, and he served from 1977 to 79 under President Jimmy Carter. Before becoming Attorney General, he served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit of the Federal Judicial Center from 1961 to 1976, appointed by President John F. Kennedy. A loyal Georgia Southwestern alumnus, Griffin Bell received the Aeolian Award in 1977, a lot of awards, a Distinguished Alumnus Award from the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. He was awarded the USG Board of Regents Hall of Fame Award in 2008. And in December of 2008, he received an honorary Doctorate of Humanities degree from Georgia Southwestern in recognition of his achievements and appreciation for all of his efforts. So in addition to Judge Bell's successful law career and the many accolades, he remained a committed supporter of Georgia Southwestern, his alma mater. Made possible by Judge Bell's significant gift, Georgia Southwestern established the Judge Griffin B. Bell Lecture Series in 1996. GSW named our newly acquired golf course after Judge Bell at a ceremony in 2008. So fast forward, I know he was, understand, an avid lover of golf, and we will be holding a ribbon cutting ceremony for the newly constructed Griffin Bell Conference Center on Thursday at 4 o'clock. And I hope you all can join us for that. Thank you. So what a special opportunity it is to feature Larry Thompson for a fireside chat format tonight. Larry and I have had conversations similar to the one that we'll have tonight over dinner or at an event, and I always leave those conversations invigorated, encouraged, and with such deep respect for Larry Thompson. Since we're going to talk about his life and his experiences throughout the program, I'll just share a few things from his bio. I know it's on the back of your program. But he has a career marked as an attorney, government affairs leader, art and culture enthusiast, an executive vice president at PepsiCo, U.S. Deputy Attorney General, and so many other things. Many of these things we'll touch on tonight. He currently serves as counsel to the Atlanta firm Finch McCraney, and we're so excited for him to be here. So I'd like to invite him and for all of us to welcome Larry Thompson. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we really want to just jump in. And I know that you were born in a small town, one that, as we talked about, is almost exactly in size the same as Americus, Hannibal, Missouri. And you're the son of hardworking parents. And I just hope that to get started, you could talk to us a little bit about how your childhood shaped the man you are today.
Well, it's good to be here, Dr. Johnson. Before I answer your question, I just want to say how honored I am to be here. Judge Bell was a friend, a mentor, one of the most important people in my life. So it just fills me with great joy and humility to be here in his hometown and to speak before people in Americus, Georgia. Well, my parents, I think I did a good job. I picked good parents. They were good people. They were hardworking people, and as I was writing the book, I wanted to just sort of crystallize in my own mind the influence that my parents had on me. And one of the things about my parents was that they did not create any limitations on me. We weren't the wealthiest people in Hannibal, Missouri. My dad worked on the railroad. My mother was a cook. But, I would dream. At some point, I think I wanted to become a veterinarian, an optometrist, never a lawyer, by the way. But they never said, oh, Larry, you can't do that. And I recall when I went to college, and it was in my sophomore year of college, I was taking an econ class or a sociology class, and the teacher was going through social stratification. And you have the wealthy people, and you have the middle class, and you have the working poor, and then you have the disadvantaged. And each of these classes had certain elements to them. And as I was thinking about it, well, the class that had the elements that fit my lifestyle was called the disadvantaged. But you know something? I never ever thought I was disadvantaged. I thought, and I was raised by my parents to be able to achieve anything that I wanted to, and anything that I could. And I want to fast forward to in 1977, when I moved to Atlanta. I got to know Dr. Benjamin Mays. Many of you may be familiar with Dr. Mays. He was the president of Morehouse College. He taught Dr. Martin Luther King. And Dr. Mays had retired, but I read his book, and it really struck me, one of the things that he said in his book, which is, it's not a sin to fail to live up to your dreams, but it is a sin to not ever have dreamed at all. And I think that sums up the impact my parents had on me.
Yeah, oh, I love that. I love that. We share with our students here that you can go anywhere from here. We know that the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, did just that. And the 72nd U.S. Attorney General, Griffin did just that. You attended a small college, right? Culver Stockton College in Missouri. And just like Americus is similar to Hannibal, I see a lot of similarities in Culver Stockton and Georgia Southwestern. In fact, as I looked at pictures of the campus, I noticed that Henderson Hall looks almost identical to Wheatley Administration Building. They both have a dome. Henderson has a silver one, this one's gold, but there's so many similarities. And I'm curious about what drove your decision to go to school there, and what are some of your favorite memories?
Well, it was very close to Hannibal, Missouri, number one. I grew up as a member of the Disciples of Christ Church, and Culver Stockton was affiliated with the Disciple of Christ Church. But I wanted to play football, and I was a pretty good high school football player. And I went down to the University of Missouri to meet the head coach, Dan Devine, and Missouri was then in the Big Eight, and they played all these big time schools, including the University of Georgia. And Dan Devine took one look at me and basically said, I don't need to look at your film. You're too small to play at the University of Missouri. So I wanted to play football, and I had a chance to play football at Culver. And I don't regret that decision. It was a terrific little school. I learned a lot from, I'll start with something I learned from the football coach. I was the middle linebacker on our team, and one of the things I sort of disregarded what the coaches had taught us, and I was actually trying to predict what the next play was going to be. And I went right, and the running back went left and gained 20 yards. And the coach took me out of the game, and he said, Thompson, what's wrong with you? And I said, well, Coach, I assume, and then he called me over to the end of the bench, and he wrote the word assume on a blackboard that he had. And you know what that means? Expletive. Don't ever expletive, because you'll make an expletive out of you or me. So that was one of my great learnings playing football at Culver Stockton College. But I think back to where I am now, and I wanted to be a social worker. I'm a child of the 60s, and I wanted to help people. And I'd asked one of my history professors to write a letter of recommendation for me to the Washington University School of Social Work in St. Louis, Missouri. And at the end of the class, he called me up to the front where his podium was, and he said, "Mr. Thompson, I understand you want to go to the Washington University School of Social Work, and there's nothing wrong with being a social worker, but have you thought about law?" I was a junior, and I had not thought about law. And I think back to that day in that class, and you know, where I've been fortunate enough to end up to this date. And you know, Culver Stockton has been a very important part of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love that story too, because it really symbolizes the importance of the relationship between faculty and students, yes, and what kind of impact those relationships have, yes, in your life. Thank you for sharing that. So you ultimately ended up at law school at the University of Michigan, and curious about what led you there, and really thinking about our students that are at a small institution, mm-hmm, and then may go to bigger places, may do different things. How did you navigate that transition from a small college to a super large university?
Well, I had a sort of a detour after I graduated from undergraduate school. This was during the Vietnam War era, and the only way I could continue to have a deferment from the military was to go to graduate school and teach. And I went to Michigan State University, and if I can tell the story about, I had a fellowship to Columbia University, which is in the news now, yeah, but that's an Ivy League school. This same professor was very happy that I had gotten this Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. I go to New York City, and Columbia is on the Upper West Side, those of you who've been up there. I'm from Hannibal, Missouri, and it had an urban disturbance that maybe 2 or 3 months before I got there. And I'm looking around, and I just said to myself, "Larry, there's no way you're going to be happy in New York City." So I came back to Canton, Missouri, where Culver Stockton's located, and told my professor, "I don't want to go to Columbia." Mm-hmm. And I ended up at Michigan State University, good Midwestern school, around things that was familiar to me, and I met my wife at Michigan State University. So I worked for a couple of years. I had to join the Navy Reserve, mm-hmm, this is, again, during the Vietnam War. And then finally, when that all was clear, I decided to go to law school. Mm-hmm. And I had in-state status, and so I, mm-hmm, applied to all the schools in the Midwest. But Michigan accepted me, and it was a pretty good law school. So
yeah,
that's how I got there.
I love that. Did you have you'd gone from these small classes to, yeah, those, large numbers of students? Did you feel prepared?
I was scared because Michigan at the time was one of the top 10 law schools. I would say about 70% of the students came from the Ivy Leagues. Mm-hmm. And here I am from a small liberal arts college in Northeast Missouri, and I didn't have any problems.
That's awesome.
I felt fully prepared. In fact, I think I did more writing, mm-hmm, at Culver Stockton than some of the kids who were from Princeton, and they didn't do as much writing as we did. And so I never felt I was at a disadvantage.
Students, do you hear that? That's wonderful. So at a prestigious law firm, King & Spalding, you met and worked with Griffin Bell. I'm just so curious and interested for all of us to learn and hear from you. What was he like, and any stories you would like to share with us?
Well, before I answer that question, Dr. Johnson, I just have to say a good part of anyone's life is luck. And when I decided to go to King & Spalding, I didn't know anything about Griffin Bell. I didn't know Judge Bell. I think, in fact, he was still the Attorney General of the United States. And so as I look back, I can only think and pinch myself is how lucky have I been to work, as I said in the book, with the wisest lawyer I've ever known. That was not planned. And it so happened that I was in litigation, he was in litigation. And over the course of a couple decades, I had the honor and privilege and good luck to work on legal matters with Judge Bell. He was a terrific lawyer, And one of the things he really taught all of us at King and Spalding was sometimes you get into law, and especially litigation, and the two lawyers are trying to outdo each other. You get mad at the lawyer, and at some point you want to vanquish him, and you want to, or her, and you want to go to court and beat them up and make them look bad. Judge Bell said, don't do that. Our job as a lawyer is to solve our clients' legal problems. His whole approach to practicing law, which I have tried to follow, sometimes unsuccessfully, but I've tried, was to try to solve my clients' legal problems. That's what we do professionally. He taught me that. And the other thing he taught me was that we are professionals, but as professionals, we have to have integrity. You have to have courage. And at some point when we started what Judge Bell called the special matters practice at King and Spalding, and we were the first big law firm in Atlanta to have a criminal practice, a criminal defense practice. We represented wealthy individuals, powerful corporations. And our very first case that we got for a big corporation was a defense contractor. It was our very first big case outside of the Atlanta area. And we flew to Florida, and we were with a bunch of lawyers from Los Angeles, New York City, Washington, D.C., and we were had a joint defense conference. And that means that the lawyers representing the executives in the company met with the lawyers representing the company. Judge Bell and I were representing the company. And we were talking about a grand jury session that was going to happen in a couple of weeks. And the lawyers there were talking about how they're going to handle their various clients. And so one lawyer would say, my client's going to testify to this in the grand jury. And another lawyer would say, no, she can't testify to that. She needs to testify to this. Now think about that. That's what you call witness tampering. The witness's testimony is what the witness's testimony is. It cannot be what the lawyer scripts her to say. And this is a crime, by the way, witness tampering. And so at some point, this was going on, and I look over at Judge Bell, and he is beet red. I could tell he was upset. And then he said, gentlemen, we've got to, there wasn't a female lawyer in the room. Gentlemen, we've got to stop this. This is improper. This is what we call witness tampering. And then they started again. And all of a sudden I'm hearing this noise, and Judge Bell is rustling up his papers, putting the papers in his briefcase, and with his southern accent said, Larry, let's go home. He was willing to walk out of this meeting, one of the most important clients that we had, one of the most important engagements that we had. And it taught me as a young partner in the firm that you have to stand on your integrity, and you can't let the prospect of having a good client and making a lot of money get in the way of doing the right thing. Mm-hmm. That was a huge thing for me to see as a young partner at King and Spalding. Huge.
Yeah. Wow. You went on to become the U.S. Deputy Attorney General in 2001. Can you talk a little bit about the path that led you there?
Well, when I was 37, I was asked to serve as the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Georgia in Atlanta. And I was a very young lawyer. I didn't apply for the job. I was working on the Mac Mattingly. You remember Senator Mac Mattingly. I was working on his committee to advise him as to who to appoint for various judgeships in Georgia and the 3 U.S. attorney positions. I didn't really want the position. I just wanted to be a partner at King and Spalding. And so at some point, we had nominated 2 people to be the U.S. attorney, and they dropped out. And the Atlanta Constitution was writing nasty editorials, criticizing Senator Mattingly, criticizing then President Reagan for not having a presidentially appointed U.S. attorney in Atlanta. And I remember Judge Bell coming into my office one day and saying, Larry, just had lunch with Earl Phillips, who was a senior partner at the law firm of Fisher and Phillips in Atlanta. And he and Judge Bell had gotten together and they decided I should be the U.S. Attorney. And at the time, I thought, well, this is just a way for Judge Bell to let me down because I wasn't going to become a partner at King & Spalding. So he had to find something else for me to do. And at that point, he says, no, you really need to take this job. You need to have important jobs in your career and don't worry about the money. The money's going to come. And you need to have jobs that serve the public interest. And this is really a good job for you. And I took it. And then, of course, I did that for 4 years and then practiced at King & Spalding with Judge Bell for another 16 years. And we had a great practice. It helped a lot of people, going back to my social work days. But when Governor Bush won in 2000, some people called me and said, well, would you like to be considered to be the Attorney General? Of course. And President Bush won, and he picked John Ashcroft from my home state, Missouri, who had been governor of Missouri and had been a United States senator from Missouri. Well, that's fine. I'll just go back to practicing law. And then someone in the administration asked me, would I serve as Deputy Attorney General? And at that time, my practice was going really good. I was doing well financially. I was 55 years old, and I was at a point where I had to start thinking about retirement. And I said, no, I'm not going to give up my partnership to be the number 2 person in the Department of Justice. I thought that was the end of it. On New Year's Day, Governor Bush, then President-elect Bush, called my home. My wife answered. She thought it was a joke. And so President-elect Bush asked me to be on his team. He says, I know you need to talk about this with your wife. Give me a call tomorrow. And you couldn't turn that down. And so when the President-elect asked you to do something. So I took the job, and Dr. Johnson, it was a very interesting process. I was eventually sworn in May of 2001. And I started going to National Security Council meetings immediately after that. And all of a sudden, I hear things that I'd never really thought about or heard about as a domestic lawyer practicing law at King & Spalding in Atlanta. And the CIA and the FBI, they were talking about noise in the system. Noise in the system. Well, what does that mean? Well, it meant that terrorists were planning to attack U.S. interest. And of course, I heard the name bin Laden for the first, really, I didn't pay any attention to that. And so I immediately got thrust into a situation where U.S. interests were jeopardized. No one had any idea that there would be an attack on our homeland, but we all thought that there would be an attack on U.S. interests someplace. And then I had 2 really fine people working with me. Mike Chertoff was the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Criminal Division. Mike went on to serve as Secretary of Homeland Security in the Bush administration. And these 2, David Criss, who was a national security expert, they worked for me. And they came to me and said, Larry, we have a problem. The law enforcement agents are not talking to the intelligence agents and vice versa. So these people are not sharing information. Well, why are they not sharing information? There was a wall between law enforcement and intelligence. Now, the reason for that was legitimate because Previously, the FBI and some of the other agencies had misused intelligence information to go after American citizens improperly. So all the wiretaps, for example, that the FBI did on Dr. Martin Luther King were done, and he was a citizen, were done improperly because the FBI used the position that Dr. King was a foreign agent. So the FBI did not have to go to a U.S. magistrate judge and get a search warrant or get a warrant to do wiretapping, as you would with any citizen. So there was a reason, what we call a civil liberties reason for this wall, but it was gone to the extreme. And these people were not talking to each other, and we knew that we were facing threats. And so I wrote a memo, and I talk about this in the book. I wrote a memo to all the FBI agents because the FBI reported to the Deputy Attorney General. I wrote a memo to them instructing them to talk to each other. This was in August of 2001. And that was a very controversial memo. I got a call from the chief judge of the FISA court wanting to know, what are you doing here? Are you eroding our civil liberties here, allowing information to go back and forth? So I actually sort of lowered the wall a little bit. I didn't eliminate the wall. And the memo basically said you have to share information if the intelligence information leads to a violation of U.S. law. And so that went down in August of 2001. And then, of course, you know what happened. 9/11, 2001, we were attacked. 3,000 Americans perished in a brutal, vicious attack. And I felt like I had not done my job. Because when you're the Deputy Attorney General, you take an oath. And I took my oath seriously. Your oath is to protect Americans. That's the oath. And here we had 3,000 people who were murdered. And I felt like I did not do my job. I felt like my team had not done our job. Was I too conservative? Was I too timid? Should I have been more aggressive? All these things went through my head. And it was a tough time in my life. It was a tough time in my life. And the first time I've ever talked about this is when I wrote the book. And it's actually been cathartic for me to talk about it because I had an internist who was very good, a gentleman in Washington, D.C., and he sent me to a therapist, and she was excellent. She was excellent. And we worked through that. But I've really never talked about this part of my life publicly until I wrote the book. And what's really refreshing is that people come up to me after I talk or they want me to sign a book, and they'll say, you know, I went through that too, and I'm glad you talked about it. Or I have a spouse who went through that. Or I have a child who went through that. And so I was depressed, and I worked through it. I had my therapist was really good. She was really terrific. She's still living now. She has dementia. And so she doesn't even know who I am. But it was a tough period in my life. And I talk about it in the book because our senior officials in our government, you know, we have some bad ones, but most of them, 95% of the people that I work with who have these important jobs really are under a lot of stress. And I respect the work that they do. And it was a tough period in my life, and I'm glad I got through it. I'm human, and we all get sick. We all catch colds, and we may get the flu, and sometimes you have depression and things like that. And I would just will tell people, don't be afraid or ashamed, and that's what I was for a long time, of having those kind of illnesses too.
Thank you so much for sharing that and encouraging all of us in that way. Really appreciate that. You know, I've had the opportunity to be involved in national conversations related to sexual assault prevention and response, and on our college campuses. And I've been involved with White House meetings. I've been invited to the White House during both the Obama and the Trump administrations for this work. And I know that you have maintained many working relationships. We've talked about them. You've had such a career, and you've had those relationships and those friendships on opposite sides of the political aisle. And it seems that it has become more and more difficult for us to maintain those friendships and relationships when we don't necessarily agree. So how have you navigated those different perspectives and those relationships?
Well, I like people, number one, but my experience is that no matter which side of the aisle we're on politically, if you will, which side of the ideological spectrum we're on, I found over my 51 years of practicing law that most of us have common ground, common priorities, and we can meet somewhere where we all agree on certain things. And a great example is an organization that I belong to. It's called the National Association of Former United States Attorneys. And you would think, oh, what kind of organization is that? That is going to give you hope. Well, but remember, we have 94 U.S. attorneys in the country, and every one of those men or women are appointed politically. They have to be confirmed by the United States Senate. So, for example, I am from the class of Reagan. And then the last meeting, we had some people who were from the class of Carter, and we had a couple men who were from Nixon. So you can imagine that they're. But the point is, you go basically from Carter to Trump, the first Trump team. And every one of those men and women, we have common priorities. We have great fidelity to our justice system. We have great fidelity to our criminal justice system and fairness of investigations and prosecutions. That's common ground. When I was Deputy Attorney General, you may recall that we had to deal with, as I was speaking earlier, with the terrorism. And our administration took a lot of heat for some of the aggressive ways we were dealing with terrorism. You know, after 9/11, I always erred on the side of protecting the American people. But I met with a young lawyer who was, very opposed to what President Bush was doing. And we had a lunch, and she wanted to meet with me. She was concerned about things that she'd heard about torture, and were we torturing these men in some of the prisons in Afghanistan and Iran. And I talked through her with what we were doing. I don't know if I convinced her that what we were doing was right, but she said something to me I write about in the book. It was very prophetic. And she says, Mr. Thompson, I think I understand this, and thank you for meeting with me. And she says, I don't think we all have to be of the same mind as long as we are of the same purpose. Mm. And that stuck with me. And I think that's what I try to do. There are lots of people I meet that are not of the same mind as me, but I think we try to have the same purpose. And so hopefully more people can think about their interactions like that, and we can move forward as a country.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Good words of wisdom and lessons for us of how do we come together and keep really important relationships intact. I love that. Do you have any other special stories that come to mind, maybe after you left the Bush administration, and maybe a phone call that you got to come to the White House?
Well, normally the Deputy Attorney General doesn't meet with the President of the United States as frequently as I did with President Bush, but because of what happened after 9/11, I met with President Bush almost every morning when we both were in the city, I would get a briefing from the CIA in the FBI building that would start at 6:30. Then I would go with Attorney General Ashcroft to the White House, maybe about 7:15, 7:30, and then we would meet with President Bush for a briefing. And then at 9 o'clock, I had a briefing at the Department of Justice with my own staff about what's going to happen during that day. This was every single day for 4 years. And I got to know President Bush well. And so when Sandra Day O'Connor, Supreme Court Justice O'Connor, you may recall her, she decided to retire. And President Bush named his really confidant, good friend, Harriet Myers. They'd known each other for a long time. She was a terrific lawyer from Dallas to be on the Supreme Court. And then there was a big storm about Harriet, and so she withdrew her nomination. And this is what happened. Josh Bolton, who was chief of staff to President Bush, gave me a call. I had left government at that point in time. I was at PepsiCo as the general counsel, and he said, you know that Harriet had withdrew her nomination, and would you be interested? Wow. And that's a big deal because I went to PepsiCo. I had a pretty generous compensation package, and if I had left, it would have been like I never was there. I would have lost everything. But this is the Supreme Court of the United States, and so at some point, I went back to Josh, and I said, I talked to my wife, and we would be willing to do it. He says, you will be getting the call from us. So guess what? The call never came. I have a friend who said that's the best thing that ever happened to you. But, and I didn't know what happened. And I was just going about my business. And then a few years later, Jan Crawford Greenberg wrote a book about the Supreme Court. And there were 2 pages devoted to what I was just telling you. And what had happened was a lot of people knew that President Bush and I had a good relationship. And when they heard that he was thinking about nominating me, I don't know if he would have, but he was thinking about it, they said, well, there was a meeting called of members of the Federalist Society. And they said, well, Larry is a good guy. We think he's one of us. He represented, and I represented then Judge Clarence Thomas before the United States Senate. But he's never talked about Second Amendment issues. Those are gun rights. See? He's never talked about reproductive abortion. And well, I hadn't, because I was a practicing lawyer. I wasn't going around giving pronouncements about abortion or gun rights. My clients wanted me to get them out of trouble. And so they thought that I wasn't grounded philosophically enough, and I never got the call. And the person who did get the call, I call this a what if moment. The person who did get the call was Sam Alito. Samuel Alito. He got the call. I didn't.
Thank you for sharing that. Wow, how fascinating too.
May I say something else about that?
Yeah.
I also, when I was at PepsiCo, and then I come back to the office, this is all the same time and they're related. And the receptionist in my building, she says, Mr. Thompson, Senator Ted Kennedy's calling you. Ted Kennedy, what is he calling me about? And so I call him back, and in his New England sort of brogue accent, Mr. Thompson, a bunch of us have been getting together and we think you would be the right person for the Supreme Court. Translation, you're the best Republican, we think. So, and then he said, we go on, and then he said, Mr. Thompson, what do you think we should do? Should I condemn you or praise you? I said, Senator, if you want me to be on the Supreme Court, you'd better condemn me. And that next weekend in the Washington Post, he took a shot at me.
You did it.
This is the way things were.
We are learning a lot. We are learning a lot. That's wonderful. You know, you've talked a lot about your public service, your private sector service, and you've noted that public service has had such a major impact on your life and your career. But I'm thinking about, you know, our students and people here with us tonight who, you know, may be hesitant. I would be interested in what is your message for someone who may be hesitant to lead today, to be a leader or to serve?
But Dr. Johnson gave me a warning that she would ask me that. And that's a very difficult, I've really never heard of that, of it put that way. And I don't know if I really have the answer, but I have to go back, since we were at the Judge Bell lecture, and go back to conversations that I've had with him. But leadership, I don't think, is a title. It's a choice. And we're all lucky in this room. We have the privilege of being able to attend a fine university and get a great education. But it's a choice you have to make as to what do you want to do with your life. And do you want to give back to society? Do you want to help people? And I remember what Judge Bell said, and that is public service as a lawyer, it really is a responsibility. You know, you're licensed by the state of Georgia, but you have responsibilities too. And I've often been asked, what is your greatest achievement? And you think about that, and it's not a plaque on the wall. It's not some citation. It's not the money I have in the bank. And the greatest achievement, as I look back at this stage of my life, and I'm 79 years old and will be 80 in November, is the people that I've influenced, the people that I've worked with, the people that I've helped. And that's what makes you a rich person. And so if I was to deal with a young person who is hesitant to be a leader, I would try to first tell them how lucky they are to be here, and then what do they want to do with their lives. But it's their choice, it's not a title.
Right. Yeah. Love that perspective and that message. Thank you. You've talked about your book a few times tonight. I want to make sure that you all know that this book is out there. It's called Quiet Counsel, and you released it in November time frame. And we're working, we're going to have some of these books in our bookstore here on campus soon. I know I ordered copies off of Amazon, so I know it's there too.
Thank you.
But a little plug for your book.
My publisher is cracking the whip on me.
I know we have some members of our audience, students and faculty and staff and community members who are writers, are excellent writers. And so before we take some questions, we'll do some questions and do a little bit of a Q&A, but before we do that, could you talk a little bit about your writing process? Because I knew you during the years, we were somewhat neighbors in the general area, and I knew when you were writing this book, and we talked about it during that time. I'm curious about the process.
Well, I've written briefs, legal briefs and legal documents. I've never written a book for public consumption. And it's work, and it's discipline. I try to, and it took me a little bit over 2 years to complete this. I had some help. I had some wonderful students at the University of Georgia Law School who were doing legal research for me. And Cara Musiano, who's now practicing law in Charleston, she was the lead researcher on this book. But it's discipline. I did it 4 days a week, at least 6 hours a day for 2 years. And And you have to have a little, you have to not be too sensitive, because when you send it in, you get all kinds of criticism. And people want to rewrite what you were doing. And then I sent it in to some publishers, and I didn't have anything in here that was real salacious. I didn't try to embarrass people. And so that's another part of this process. One publisher who I really wanted to publish the book, but they rejected it, he said, I like your book, I like your policy discussions, but this is a Washington book, and the way to have a successful Washington book is to identify your enemies and settle the score in the book. I didn't do that here.
I know that we're going to close tonight with you reading a little portion. That's how we'll end. But before we do that, let's open it up for any questions or comments.
Thank you for speaking tonight. What would you say was the most difficult decision you had to make in your term as Deputy Attorney General?
So I'm going to repeat the question just to make sure everybody could hear that. And it was, what was the most difficult decision that you had to make when you were a U.S. Deputy Attorney General?
First of all, that entire experience was the most difficult I've had. It was searing, and so without getting into things that I'm not supposed to get into, we do not permit assassinations in our country. They're illegal. However, we have provisions in the law to deal with enemy combatants. And these are people terrorists who kill or are trying to kill Americans. And a part of my job was to advise senior executives in the Bush administration as to the status of people like that and what to do in terms of protecting American citizens. So those were difficult things to do, because as a lawyer, I'm trained and I'm used to the process where you charge somebody with a crime, they have a lawyer, and you make a decision as to whether or not they're guilty or innocent. But when you're dealing with enemy combatants, when in effect you're at war with an enemy who's trying to kill you, you have to make decisions. Those were difficult decisions.
When we grew up, we thought the FBI was next to God. I mean, in the last few years, not just with Trump, but before that, they've just seemed to have gone to pot in a way. Do you agree?
So the question is about the FBI. I'm going to summarize that. I appreciate your words and the description of, how the FBI was viewed at one time, and then how it may be seen now, and how do you see that?
Yeah. No, I think there have been some issues that have arisen in the recent past. I wrote an editorial. One of the few I've done since I left government. That was published in the Washington Post, and I was very critical of Jim Comey. You all remember, so that's public. But one of the things that I've seen is that now we have social media, and there have always been some difficult agents in the FBI and other government agencies, but it didn't get transmitted. The publicity about it didn't get transmitted the way it does now. And so I don't know if there's an increase in it, but I know increase in bad agents, but I know we are aware of bad agents more than we were in the past. However, I will say this in my experience, and again, I haven't been in government for a while, but the FBI agents that I work with, the DEA agents I work with, the United States Marshals that I worked with during my time in government, were unbelievable men and women. and they were dedicated, they were professionals, they were smart, they liked what they were doing, and they could make a lot more money in private practice or in the business world. And I appreciate their, dedication to us and protecting us. But, I have been critical of the FBI too, and again, my op-ed with Jim Comey. So I'm going to tell another. Can I tell another story?
Absolutely. Please do.
So one of my dear friends in life as a prosecutor was Jeff Sessions. You all know who Jeff Sessions is?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And Jeff and I served as prosecutors together in the Bush administration. He was U.S. Attorney in Mobile, and I was U.S. Attorney in Atlanta. In fact, in order to save money on our expenses when we went to Washington, he and I would room together. So we're good friends. And then President Trump appointed Jeff to be the Attorney General. Now that didn't work out for him, but the point is, he called me one time and asked me to testify before the United States Senate for him. And I did. And my wife was in the room because it was early in the morning, and President Trump had not been sworn in. This is the first administration. And I said to Jeff, you tell President Trump that when he gets sworn in, the next day he should fire Comey. Well, he didn't do it, and you see what happened.
Yeah.
Anything interesting about PepsiCo? I'm a little fascinated because I know that seems like a little bit of a turn where you had been before. Any one story come to mind about a lesson you learned at PepsiCo, or just a little something entertaining for you?
Well, I do.
Let me repeat it really
Oh, I'm
quick because
sorry,
I think
I'm
some of
sorry.
the people in the back may not have heard it. Related to your experience at PepsiCo and maybe a story or something from there.
I write about some of that in the book, and but I think that the better way to answer your question is, interestingly, when I was leaving government, the general counsel position at PepsiCo had come open, but previous to that, the general counsel position at the Coca-Cola company had come open. And I write about in the book a case that I tried for a Coca-Cola executive, and he was acquitted. And I had a great relationship with the Coca-Cola company, my law firm did, and I had interviewed for the job, the general counsel position that was open. But again, I didn't get a response, and at some point I was asked to interview for the Pepsi-Cola job, and then I accepted it, the interview. And I go up to White Plains, New York. It's really Purchase, New York, but it's close to White Plains. And it was like an out-of-body experience walking into the Pepsi headquarters and having been. But the fact of the matter is, it was a great experience working at PepsiCo. We had business in 220 countries, and I really learned a great deal. And the most important thing I learned was, whenever I traveled overseas, and I went to a lot of different countries, when I came back to the United States, I said, there's no other better country than this one.
That's awesome. Let's take one last question. Dr. Laughlin?
Since you had such high security clearance, did you have to ask for permission to write your book? And was anything redacted that you could share?
I had a hypothetical in the book.
Take one more. Come in.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
In your opinion, what is the most troubling constitutional issue or question that we currently face in this republic?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it's one that
Yeah,
many of us are thinking about.
I'm going to approach it from the standpoint of someone who has been in the justice system, his entire career. And I am troubled by some of the executive orders that the president has issued. And I'm not troubled by the orders per se, but the orders work to, if they work, they would inflict harm on an individual. And a bedrock principle of our country, and it's enshrined in the Constitution, is that if you're going to harm me, I'm entitled to due process. And I'm entitled to have a process that we go through to make certain that the government's entitled to harm me. I'm troubled by that. I think the president has the right to do these kinds of things, but to do them without subjecting the targets to them of process, that bothers me. That's going to get to the Supreme Court at some point. And I trust whatever the court decides. I trust their wisdom.
So let's close the evening with a reading, if you would share with us, and any other comments you have, and then we'll close with the reading of your book.
So I've been blessed to practice law for 51 years. I've had all kinds of cases. But after I retired from PepsiCo, a young rabbi from Los Angeles flew out to New York to meet me before I could relocate back to Georgia. And he talked to me about a man who was an Orthodox Jewish businessman. He owned the largest kosher meatpacking plant in the country. And he had been indicted for using illegal workers in his plant. There's no excuse for that, but if you look at any meatpacking plant in the United States, you're going to see illegal workers. But in any event, he decided to go to trial. And then the government issued what we call in the legal world a superseding indictment, accusing him of financial fraud. And the case was tried in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My client, his name was Sholem Roboshkin, and I did the case pro bono, which means free. I didn't get paid anything for it. And Sholem received, at 53 years old, a first-time offender and a nonviolent offense, received 27 years in prison sentence. 27 years. One of the most egregious matters of injustice I'd ever encountered. The case had gone up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, and they turned it down, and went up to the United States Supreme Court, and it was turned down. So I was doing work pro bono, what we call post-conviction litigation, to try to get the government to turn around this egregious decision. 27 years. And he was Orthodox. He had 10 children. One of them was special needs. And I write about this in the book because it's perhaps, after all the stuff that I've been through in my career, it was perhaps the most profound case I've ever been involved in. And if you permit me to read you why. Gotta find it. So we were going around the country trying to gain some kind of pardon or clemency for Sholem, given what we thought had been a fair amount of prosecutorial misconduct. And I was working with another lawyer by the name of Gary Apfel. And Gary is a fine lawyer, and he is from Los Angeles. And so let me just read. As Sholem's lawyers, Gary and I were compelled at each juncture to relay news to Sholem's daughter, Rosa, and also to Rabbi Boyarsky, who was coordinating our efforts to seek justice on behalf of our client. And what was so remarkable about this was that despite our frustrations, because the door was shut in our face so many times, despite our frustrations, Rabbi Boyarsky responded to each setback with poise and equanimity. He never lost face. What we relayed to him was not bad news to his ears. He told me countless times not to worry and that God would provide justice for Sholem. And the rabbi proved to be right. At the end of 2017, President Trump granted Sholem clemency and commuted his sentence to time served. To this day, I don't understand why President Trump made this decision. This case involved allegedly illegal workers, which was a hot political issue at the time. I've seen this movie over a dozen times, and it never ends this way. Sholem was free after nearly 8 years in prison. But in the days that followed, after watching thousands of people in Brooklyn celebrate the unlikely news of his release, I was convinced of at least one thing. The commutation did not come about solely because of our legal work. Relentless as the Rabbi, Gary, and I had been in pursuing every angle, something more powerful had intervened on Sholem's behalf. To my mind, his freedom was an act of God. To this very day, that's what I believe. I get choked up at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you'll attend other investiture events we have scheduled for this week. And again, to Larry Thompson, and for remembering Griffin Bell in the way you have today and in your life, thank you so much.
Thank you. I get choked up every time I read.